Hey folks, Mr. B here. Welcome to lesson 1.3 on the different types of cells. You're going to hear me say a lot about primitive cells known as prokaryotic cells, the ones that existed before there was a nucleus and a nuclear membrane. You're going to hear me talk about eukaryotic cells, which means true nucleus. And those are advanced cells, such as the ones you and I have as animals, plants, fungi, all sorts of things. So let's kick into this and get going. All right, so here we go. Choose a different color. I like purple. So there's a variety of cellular life on the planet. In section 1.2, we talked about viruses and how they really aren't cellular life because they're not composed of cells and they can't have their own babies directly, and they don't undergo respiration in the sense that they don't eat, they don't have metabolism, they don't produce waste. It's kind of interesting, right? When you get into the cellular or the cellular versus non-cellular discussion surrounding viruses, okay? And regular cells. So when we get started with looking at cellular life, some of the oldest cellular life originated on our planet. And it's sort of hard for you to imagine this, but the planet was hot and very what we call Hadean, like Hades, sort of get the idea of sort of a hellscape. It was very hot. The atmosphere would have been poisonous to us now with methane and sulfur compounds, and there was no real free oxygen to consume, right? And geologists, we see this a lot. When we look back through the geology history of the planet, we can actually tell when oxygen showed up. We can actually see when iron ore was laid down, and that was a long time ago. If we think about the life forms that would have had to exist under these conditions, we're looking at life forms that would have to, well, not be hopelessly dependent on oxygen, right? Especially when you go down very deep in the ocean, there's very little to no oxygen, right? Dissolved into that water. And light really doesn't make it down that far. So I'll have to draw a sun up here. Everybody loves a purple sun. The rays of the sun, they don't make it down to the deep. It's too far. So it's not like the critters down there are making energy with sunlight, which is kind of sad. So we'll just kind of go like this. Sorry, Mr. Golden Sun. Right? These forms of life don't depend on you directly. In fact, they rely upon really simple compounds coming out of the crust of the earth. And it's interesting how you could see it here, right? You're sort of looking, you're saying, okay, what's that? Right? And let's use a lighter color, right? So you can say, well, what is that? What's going on there? And that is a lot of sulfur in the form of very sulfur compounds. Sulfurs can be used in a way that can be quite energy rich for living critters to sort of make use of. It's not like photosynthesis. It's actually the use of chemical compounds directly to harness energy. It's more of a conversation I usually have around grade 11, but it's sort of migrated down here. And they're living in a way sort of off the metabolism, processing raw chemicals. It's a very extreme environment. Let me show you what I'm talking about here. When you go down far enough and you're in the ocean, very, very dark, the idea is that you're at a geothermal vent and materials are coming up from the earth and they're just venting into the ocean. And it can actually create a whole community of these cells. Well, not create them, but there's some very primitive bacteria type cells that can live off what is in this sort of plume of what looks like smoke. We've seen sort of sulfur compounds, methane compounds. There's a lot here, and it turns out it provides just enough energy for some living things to survive. They're called black smokers because you'll see it down here. You have to realize the water pressure is really high, so the water should be boiling, but it's not boiling because it's under so much pressure. Sort of like a pressure cooker, because this is down a long ways. If you look at, this is the same picture from the slideshow, but if you look closely, you can see that there are there are things growing around these plumes. And it's kind of absolutely fascinating that, oops, there we go, that you can get that kind of effect. It's going to give me grief. There we go. Lots of living things. In fact, it can form a very simple community over time. Let's see if I can get there. There we go. You could see those sort of red sort of compounds, those sort of tubes coming up, and it becomes a foundation of a community on the ocean floor. Yeah, geothermal vents, who knew? Now, we have to talk about what that means. This is a pretty inhospitable environment, which would have been similar to the early formation of the planet, right? There wouldn't have been a lot to eat. There wasn't any photosynthesis. It was a little too early for all that stuff. So when we look at cell types, we have to say that there had to be earlier cells, like old ones. And we can really divide cells into two kinds. When you look at cells that are advanced like us, they look like this Cadillac over here, right? There's some interesting stuff in there. You look at all the bits. You're like, what's this? Well, that's a nucleus, right? And it's floating around in some kind of a jelly. Kind of a jelly we'll talk about called cytoplasm, right? And there's other things floating around in there. Everything kind of has a job, right? It's fascinating. It warrants a conversation. This means true nucleus. That's what eukaryotic means. So EU means true, and karyo means nucleus. So there you go. Truly a nucleated cell. An older term for an older cell is you've got prokaryotic. So karyo does mean nucleus, okay? But if you look inside this thing, our friend over here has a nucleus, right? This round thing. This is where you find your DNA, right? DNA inside, right? Let's put that in brackets. DNA would be in there, in us. It's got its own compartment, like a suitcase. But if you look at these guys and you zoom in, you're like, where's their DNA? And it's like, it's all this fuzzy stuff. It's like, huh? There's some fuzzy DNA here. And sometimes you'll find these extra little bits of DNA out here. They're kind of fascinating, right? You got those. You're saying to yourself, okay, wait a minute. So its DNA isn't like in a suitcase. It's just all over the place. Yeah, that's how it was in the early days, right? Hopelessly disorganized, right? Like certain binders I've seen. Yes, we won't mention who. Okay. Pro really means, in a way, you could mean before there was. Well, before, but then I like to say before there was. Helps you learn, right? So altogether, it's like before there was, oops, extra quotes, before there was a nucleus. Because these guys don't have a nucleus, right? No nucleus. And they look pretty simple inside. Literally, when you look inside of our cells, which are way, way bigger than these cells, right? These cells on the left are millions, like they're literally hundreds of times smaller than our cells, right? Ours are so much bigger and there's so much more space. We've evolved all these extra giblets inside, all this stuff. So you have to start somewhere. So you start a little less complicated, right? You start with the prokaryotic cells. So, example, bacteria, like E. coli that we've talked about before. And on the right, you could say example, animal cells. Below, right? And you'll learn to differentiate between, an advanced cell and a non-advanced cell. It's important to know the difference, right? Just remember, prokaryotic, they're so crude, they don't even have a nucleus, right? There's not much going on inside, but we'll talk about what it is because it's more than you think in the prokaryotes. Lots more going on in the eukaryotes. So prokaryotics don't have a nucleus. We've already kind of defined those. They're simpler. They can make their own little proteins. They have these little things called ribosomes, right? These little, and I'll draw them much bigger than they are, right? And these make protein. Think about it. Your hair's made of protein. You got protein in your skin, all that kind of stuff. And then we've got the DNA. I'll choose a different color for the DNA this time. We'll make it kind of purpley. right? It's got purpley fuzzy DNA. And all this stuff floats around in a jelly, right? It floats around in a jelly. So they do have something called a cytoplasm, right? And let's make a little note about it because, you know, it's important. So we'll say right here, right there. I'll put a little spot. We'll say watery cytoplasm. That's the term, cytoplasm, the plasm of the cell, right? So, not much. We've got ribosomes. Hey, let's make a list. Why not? Okay, you got ribosomes. And you've got cytoplasm. And you've got DNA, but it's not in a nucleus, right? There's little bits of it floating around sometimes. And you've also got cytoplasms, that's a new word. Ribosomes, cytoplasm, DNA, and really these are just basic organelles. Let's say that, basic organelles. Like little organs, right? Think of this as little organs. Cells have these little things inside of them, sort of like organs. So we call them organelles, little organs, right? It's kind of neat. They are pretty simple. But what's amazing is they get by being simple. It works out really well to be simple. Sometimes simple is good, right? Why make it so complicated? Other things we'll talk about, they can move around. So they can have these whip-like, at your, kind of for, like when I was in grade, I'd be like, describe these for me. And I'm like, well, they're just kind of like, they're little protein strands and they can kind of whip them around, kind of almost like hair. And they can rotate them this way and they can rotate them that way. And it's like whipping your hair around in a mosh pit. And if you do it, you can kind of propel yourself forward and back. So that's kind of what they do. That's a big oversimplification. Big oversimplification. We should mention that they have a skin. So if we zoom in, they do have skin like us. That skin, if I drew it in red, would be right, let's go like this, right there. This is what they're trying to indicate here, right? They're sort of touching the edge of the skin, but I'll go all the way there. Okay, so that would be like the skin. And then outside the skin, they kind of have a tough layer because they don't want to die, so they put a little layer of armor kind of from there to there. And that armor, which is being sort of drawn here, right? They've got it here too, right? That's called their cell wall. And it protects them, right? Because you don't want to run into things like a balloon and pop. So yeah, they have cell membrane, they have a cell wall. It's very cool. These are fun to study. If you like microbiology like I do, this is fun. This is what E. coli looks like. Example, E. coli, Escherichia coli. Very slick. Eukaryotic cells are advanced. They've been around longer. In fact, if we had to kind of put a time frame on it, the first cells that were this advanced are about roughly, I always love numbers in biology, 2.2 billion years, right? They've been around that long, about the same length of time as the little critters we find in pond water called protists. That's a neat group of eukaryotic cells that gave rise to all the other eukaryotic cells. And we know that they're somewhere around 2.2 billion years. They've been around a while. So they've got a nucleus, right? This thing here, right? Contains genetic material. It's blue, so I'm going to draw a little red border around it. That's your nucleus right there, right? Nucleus. I mean, it's in white, but hey, why not label it? That's your nucleus. And all your DNA's in there, which we kind of yacked about. And all these little organs that we'll get into in the slideshow. These are way bigger, right? While we get down to millionths of a meter with some germs, these are pretty big. Like, for example, your red blood cells, right? If you've ever seen a red blood cell, kind of looks like this, right? From above, or if you look from the side, red blood cells are kind of cool, right? They kind of look like a jelly donut. And you'll see that they're about 30 micrometers or 30, here's micro, there we go. 30 micrometers, 30 millionths of a meter, right? That's small, but we can see it under the microscope. You would start to see it, the grade 12s will see it under low as a red haze. Starts to become pretty clear under medium. And then if we do that big lens, that oil immersion, 1,000 times where we do the oil trick, we could see them pretty close. We can see them really well defined. They're very cool. We'll get into all these little bits, okay? Something I can't show you, that's kind of a neat little link that was left in the slideshow. Neat comparison of the cruder cells, right? So let's just say prokaryotic. We'll just say like bacteria, right? Versus eukaryotic cells, which we'll call advanced, like us. We're pretty advanced, okay? So prokaryotic cells, number one, they don't have their DNA inside a membrane. So their DNA, right, which I know I draw poorly, but there we go, isn't inside of a membrane. But our membrane is kind of like this, kind of cool. So when you look at our DNA, right, our DNA is in a membrane. It's organized, which is good. Trying to draw DNA, must draw DNA, there we go. When you look at prokaryotic cells, they're little mini organs, right? Like the organs in our body have like little membranes around them, which is a way I remember this. Prokaryotic cells, no, there's no membrane around anything inside there. Not their DNA, not their ribosomes, their little protein makers, nothing. But if you look at our little energy makers, right, in our cells that look like this, right? These are the little energy makers called mitochondria, right? They're actually covered in a layer of our membrane. So yes, they are bound by a membrane like that. Black membrane, I'll put mem for short, right? So that, you'll find that everything's kind of bagged in a eukaryotic cell with some exceptions. Our friends here are tiny. Bigger than viruses, but we're bigger than them, right? If they are micrometers, right? We are tens of micrometers. We bigger than them, right? Some of our cells even bigger than that. But sometimes simple is good. Simple works. Bacteria, you give them food, they have a metabolism, they can build stuff up, tear it down, just like we do, they get by. So sometimes basic works. So does advanced, right? An analogy would be with cars. We have very fancy automated computer features with cars nowadays, but they used to be a lot more basic than that. Oh yeah, right? They used to have something called a carburetor before fuel injection, so holy smokes. Time marches on. But sometimes advanced doesn't mean better. One of my professors said that. He said, don't ever forget it. Okay, so at this point, you could draw, like a Venn diagram is where you compare things, right? So you could do this, and you go like that, and you create an intersection. And what you say, this is the Venn diagram below, folks. You could put prokaryotic, right? Pros and euks, like this. And you could say their characteristics, right? Distinct characteristics. But then in the middle, right, you could put characteristics that they have in common. So pause the video, drop one of these, and try to do one from memory. It's not bad. And then come back. Okay, I'm assuming you paused the video. We'll see if you really did. If you were talking about something that maybe they had in common, you could say, well, wait a minute. It doesn't matter if you're prokaryotic or eukaryotic. You had to have a ribosome to make protein. You're like, oh yeah. I mean, we're getting into more detail than we've covered yet, but they have to have that. Okay, so they both have that. So things in common, right? They got to have stuff like a cytoplasm, right? And they have to have skin. So they have to have like a cell membrane. That's kind of a thing. So you're starting to see what characteristics they have in common, which means, yeah, these are the oldest characteristics. If something old and something new shares it, well, then because it was with something old, it's been around a long time? That sound about right? Mm-hmm. We'll keep going. But those are 3 examples I was just going to throw out there for you. Poof. Bacteria are prokaryotic cells. So if you're looking at what you're looking at this side, you're actually looking at what are called cosi bacteria. And they're grouping up. So if you've ever heard of it, this appears to be a Staphylococcus coccus arrangement. And it's kind of fancy. If you've ever had staphylococcus, this can happen on the skin. This isn't so great. You've probably heard of streptococcus, right? Where that you can get strep throat. By cocci, we mean that they're round, right? That's called a coccus. Cocci. I guess I'll extend this a little bit so you can see it, right? This white thing here, right? That's what we're talking about. The arrangement is staphylo. It just means they're clustered up like grapes, right? If you look at the other side, that's another kind of bacteria, and they're clustering up too. They're not multicellular, but they like to hang out together and work together, right? Because many hands make light work. You've probably heard that before, Together, everyone achieves more. Team, that acronym, right? So these are two types of bacterial cells. The crazy thing about this, and something we know, we talk about way more in Biology 11, is these are the oldest types of cells, right? They call them the Archaean, the ancient ones. There are ancestors of modern bacteria that are even older than modern bacteria. So these are what we call the new bacteria, right? And a way to say that is sometimes we call them the true bacteria or the eubacteria. This makes for a very interesting discussion when we get on later in grade 11. But we'll just leave it at that. Old and new. E. coli would be an example of a new one. So they don't have a nucleus. Check. That would be item 1. They have a cell membrane, cell wall, jelly cytoplasm. I'm getting ahead of myself. 2. They have genetic material. We get it. It's DNA. Their genetic material, viruses can use RNA as their genetic material, but you won't find cells using RNA as their central genome. No. So this stuff is just floating in the cytoplasm, right? Not contained in a nucleus. There's no bag around this stuff like it is with us. And then they've got that flagella for movement, right? So the reason I didn't put number 4 there, right, was because not all bacteria have flagella. Some do. Some can move around. And we've kind of talked about this. So no nucleus, right? They've got a wall, a skin, right, and a jelly interior. And that's where their little stuff floats around. If you're looking for into them and you're like, okay, so what do they have really inside of themselves that you would kind of call an organelle? I'd be like, well, what, you mean like a ribosome? You can't put a bag around a ribosome. If you cover it in membrane, it can't do its job. We have ribosomes too, right, that make protein, but you can't put them in a bag or they're sealed off and they can't do their job. So, yes. So that's an organelle. They really don't have any other organelles, kids. They don't. It's pretty much the ribosome. Whereas this friend here, he's prokaryotic, right? Which means just a primitive cell, but when you get past this, you'll see, everything's in a bag almost in advanced cells because we're fancy. Archae Bacteria. These are oldest. And they were here at the origin of the planet, right? Well, not when it formed, but when we look at our life forms, these guys are still around. They're hanging out in geothermal vents. They hang out in the scariest places you can imagine. They like no oxygen environments. To them, it's a poison, right? Because there was no oxygen in the beginning of the planet. None, because it required photosynthesis to produce a lot of oxygen that we have in the atmosphere now. To them, it's a poison. It wasn't there when they came into existence. They are also, there's ones that are salt-loving. So salty that it would kill other cells. They love it. You've got ones that are acid-loving. Like, really? Yeah, I don't know about you. You ever swim around in battery acid? Doesn't work for me. They can live in the most inhospitable environments ever. Let's write that. Inhospitable. Inhospitable homes, because that's what they like. The reason the bacteria down there in those black smokers is because there's no oxygen, and there's all that those sulfur compounds and things like that coming out that they can actually consume. So yes, these are the conditions that they live under. So what's crazy is they are a lot like us, which is, this part just blew my mind when I first learned it. Sort of like, what? They have genes in common with advanced cells. Okay, so here's what I'm trying to tell you. We've got more DNA in common with them than with our friend E. coli here, right? It's strange, right? E. coli looks like the younger bacteria, but we have less in common with the younger bacteria. Yes, you heard it here. We have more in common with these guys, and they're old. So, yep, it's a mystery that we're still looking into. We have way more in common with these guys, but they're what we like to call extremophiles, right? They like the extremes. Okay, so there's the extreme part. And phile means to like or love. They love the extremes, right? No oxygen environments, acidic environments, so salty that it would dehydrate and kill anything. Yep, they're like, yeah, works for me. Gotta love it. When you look at these extreme environments, right, I was showing off the black smoker, but when you look at the Archaeans and you look at some of these places they're living in, it's like, what? Like they're living in, look at this. This is like a salt flat. They can live in that. The rest of us would be dehydrated and die. They have some very unique cell chemistry, but they have genes in common with us, but they're just ancient. They're so ancient. Find them at super depths. You'll find the Archaeans in like hot acidic pools, alkaline lakes. You're like, what is going on? They look like bacteria, but they're not. Oldest. That's why we call them the Archaeans. If we go back far enough, sort of on a tree of life, I normally reserve this for grade 12, but hey, why not? If you see Archaea, sort of what you're seeing is a branching structure. If you look at the Archaeans, they kind of went off on their way and they're living on their existence. And if you look to the bottom, it says bacteria. Well, they're living on their little branch in the tree of life. And all the advanced cells, all the ones you know, take a look at it. Plants, animals, fungi, and the little pond water dudes, protista, they're all living as advanced cells off on their own particular branches on the tree of life. I love the structure of the tree of life. It's so fascinating. I know, biologist prerogative. We love our subjects. So, Archaeans. This is another chance where you can do a compare-contrast thing, right? Make a T-chart, right? So you could say similar and different. You could do a Venn diagram, one of those. You could say, bacteria, right? And you could put the archae, and you could do a circle for this. You could say, this is where you say, okay, what's unique, right? So you put the unique stuff here, right? For each one, like for example, how Archaeans don't like oxygen. And then in the middle, you could put stuff that's in common, right? That makes you think. That is one of the best ways to study, because guess what happens when teachers make assessments? Yeah, they're thinking about this kind of stuff, right? Do you know what's unique to bacteria, what's unique to Archaeans, right? So when you go back and look over, right, your diagrams, right, and your notes. But we got to move on. We've got a big show today. If you look at the eukaryotic cells, right, the true nucleus ones, okay, we have a nucleus. So if you're looking for it, I'll circle it in red, right? Here's the nucleus in something like a plant cell with the little green bits. You've probably seen those before. Those are the green bits that do photosynthesis. And here is the same thing in us. So, surprise, surprise, it's something they have in common. We have a lot in common, right? We have these little organelles. You might notice that we're kind of missing these ones, right? You and I can't hang out in the sunlight, right? Right there. And kind of make sugar. These are called chloroplasts. We'll talk about them at length, right? But they're what work with the sunlight to make the sugar, right, in plants. Mr. Golden Sun has a happy face. There we go. We don't have that. So we, as the cell at the bottom, have to find a way to find food in our environment and to eat it, right? Because we can't make our own food. Plants are kind of like a car that can make their own gas and just run. That is a trick. Don't give plants too much credit because they're not the ones who invented it in the first place. It actually goes back to bacteria. But plants get a lot of credit for stuff that they didn't develop. So they both have processes to survive. And we'll get into it. But we have to go through the organelles first. The first one is a cell membrane. So when you look at a cell membrane, right, if we say A and we're looking at this, the cell membrane is this skin, right? It's this skin that goes all the way around. So I'll just draw it like that, right? It goes all the way around like that. And in a plant cell, it's kind of underneath this layer of armor they have, right? And that's called a cell wall. So whenever you eat a salad or you eat celery, you're running into a lot of cell walls. You can definitely tell. We often call it fiber. In an animal cell, right, we just have that skin. And I talked with the grade 12s at length, and I've talked with the grade 10s at length about how it's kind of like a soap bubble, but it's tough. It's like a soap bubble that's really hard to pop. And then if you do stick something through it, it doesn't really pop. It's like almost like putting your finger through some oil, right? Our cell skin is actually pretty tough. The cell membrane's good about letting things in and out. And that's important. You got to let stuff in. It's got to let in oxygen, right? Because we need that. And then it's got to let out carbon dioxide, right? And other wastes, they have to leave, right? We need water to get in, right? So there's got to be a way for stuff to get in and out. And cell membranes are really good at that. Cells also produce things. Animal cell, well, for example, some animal cells could produce, so let's have something coming out, right? We could say, example, I don't know, hormones, right? You have cells in your body that make these things and they have to get into your blood, right? So hormones like testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, right? Stuff like that gets out into your body, right? So yeah, cell organelles, little organs. And virtually all of them are covered in a layer of membrane, except for the ribosome. We'll talk about the ribosome, those little dark things, okay? Very small. The cytoplasm in a cell is the watery environment. So when they go to show it, they're trying to show off the watery environment, right? And if I were to draw it, I would actually say it's this watery stuff here, right? Let's draw an X, right? So let's draw cytoplasm. They've used the letter B, but I can show it a little bit more easily, right? Cytoplasm, everything's floating around in it, circulating around in it. So up here, I know in the plant cell they say B, and it's kind of curious because it almost looks like they're pointing at that blue thing. But what they're really trying to point at is this, right? Right here. X marks the spot. Right? Cytoplasm. Like that, okay? It's just the fluid that everything's floating in. So you can think of it as a fluid and things are floating around in it, whether or not it's one of these or it's some of these ribosomy things, right? Or, even the chloroplasts in a plant, right? Those green things that make sugar. When you kind of look at them from the side, they kind of look like this. I know, people are going to hack me for this not being so coolly drawn, but one does one's level best. So cytoplasm, jelly fluid, stuff floats around, right? Yes. And yes, there is a form of cytoplasm in the Archae bacteria. They have to have it. Bacteria have to have this stuff. Where else is your DNA going to go? It's got to float around in something, even if you're a bacterium. It's just that our DNA is cool. It's in a little suitcase we call the nucleus. Cell wall, well, I kind of referred to it, but if we zoomed in a little bit, right? It is here, right there, that dark outer protective covering. This is something humans don't easily digest because, we're not termites or anything. We don't have the enzymes to break down cell walls. So for us, it becomes a nice source of fiber, right? So you don't find that in animal cells, right? So cell wall. Cell wall. Often I'll just say CW like this, and I don't mean the network, cell wall. Animal cells don't do that. Animal cells don't, we don't need, well, I shouldn't say we don't need a cell wall. We use our cells and they dogpile upon each other and we have different structural support. Plants have to sit there against gravity, so they need a cell wall to hold them up, especially if you're out of the ocean. It is pretty hard when you're out of the ocean to be a plant because this gravity thing's trying to pull you down the whole time, right? It has, a cell wall is made up of something called cellulose, right? And you see a lot of cellulose in wood, right? We can't digest it, but fun fact, the bacteria, like E. coli in your gut, love cellulose. So feed them celery, they'll make your life better. And because of it, they get this box-like shape, which is pretty cool, right? We look more like a balloon here because we don't have a sort of carbohydrate box like cellulose holding us together. Because that's what cellulose is. It's the same kind of stuff you find in grass, you find in wood. Yeah, it is supportive. The nucleus. We've already talked about it several times, but hey, it's in here that you find your DNA. Whether you're a plant or an animal, right? Or a fungus or one of those protist little dudes. That's where you find your DNA. So DNA lives there. DNA zone, right? Or compartment. It was smart for us to put our DNA into a location like that because we can do some really cool stuff with our genes when we have them all organized into one space. We're very good at dividing too, right? We have, humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, 22 chromosomes and 2 sex chromosomes, right? And yeah, when we go to divide, we have to gather up all our chromosomes and double the material and then move the duplicated material to each new cell. Neat trick. It's called mitosis. You're going to learn a lot about that in grade 9. Don't say I didn't warn you. Cool. Vacuoles. Now these things are balloons inside of the cells. So it's interesting how they go to show this. But if I was in a cell, let's say if I was in an animal cell, I would draw a bag like this. And if that bag was clear, right, some of these vacuoles just contain water. So if they're clear, it's a water vacuole, right? It's a membrane bag of stuff. So this would, for example, be a water vacuole. I drew it really big. Water vacuole. Vacuole. Now, if we had a bag of food that had been brought into the cell, right, it would probably look like this, sort of dark inside, like that, and that would be a food one. That's usually the two types you see, right? They're really big bags of stuff. There's smaller bags, they get a different name. But plants have the biggest water bag ever. You've probably been looking at this and wondering, what the heck is this thing, right? Like, what is that? Right? Like, it goes all over the place. If you've ever had a plant that's wilted and you water it, this is a giant water bag inside. And when it fills, it pushes everything else out. It's like you blew up a balloon in the middle of the cell. It's called a central water vacuole, right? It's huge. It's massive. And when plants wilt, it comes in towards the middle, and then the plant's their cell wall doesn't have anything pushing on it. And then when you fill it back up, it fills up. It's pretty cool. So they call it let's give E the credit it deserves. This is the biggest one you'll see. Central water, like that, because I'm lazy. I'm kidding. It's chemistry, people. You're allowed to do that, right? It's huge. We don't have that, and we don't need it. Think of it as a water reservoir for plants because they need water to do photosynthesis with, to make energy from sunlight. You noticed? You got to water your plants or they don't like it. Yeah. The ones in animals are just smaller, right? And more numerous. So you make water vacuoles when you have lots of them floating around, especially if you're thirsty, and that water starts coming into the cell. Oh yeah, you make quite a few of them. So vacuoles. So they're Let's just call them bags, right? And they're named after what's in them. Little membrane bags. Cool beans. Mitochondria. You'll notice I've drawn this thing a couple of times now. It's so funny. It's basically, it's funny. It kind of looks like I drew a hot dog or something, except that's red. Well, I guess, like when you go to put the mustard on, right? I sort of do this when I make my hot dog. Okay, it's not a hot dog. It's an energy maker. And you'll see these little red things, right, that show up. And they're all over the place, right? So you'll see them here, right? And they're covered in membrane. They're down here. You got lots of them. And their job is to make energy. So basically you put in fuel, right? They get fuel and they produce fuel in, energy out. Like that, okay? So they are cool. And the neat thing about them is they're meant to take in various forms of energy, and that's good. Whether or not you consume carbohydrates, you can consume proteins, it really doesn't matter. They can basically act like a little gas-powered generator, and they produce the energy that the cell needs. You're going to notice that they're also in here. People forget that, yeah, why did you think plants were making fuel? So they could burn it. They have them too. It's just, right? They can make their own gas, right? We can't. So we have to go out and get nutrients. So we have to take the fuel in to produce the energy out, right? That's the idea. So that the cell can do work and help keep us alive and stuff like that and keep us warm. One of the reasons we breathe out carbon dioxide, a waste product from these little critters, is CO2, right? And, fun fact, whenever you burn something, you produce carbon dioxide and a little bit of water. Always happens. So our little bean-shaped guys. And remember, they're coated by a layer of membrane. Like that, a little extra layer of membrane. They kind of have a double bag. We call them mitochondria. Yes, you discovered it here. Item F is a mitochondrion. Chloroplasts, our little green friends. Yeah, you'll see them from the side. A chloroplast has these stacks of green stuff in it, right? And it's this green chemical in plants that, when the sun shines on it, makes sugar, right? So the rays of the sun. And I always have to draw Mr. Happy Sun. There he goes, right? These guys, they produce two things. It's kind of neat. They produce oxygen, which is really good. So we're going to need plant life to get to Mars, people. We can't take enough oxygen with us, right? And they produce an abundance of oxygen, and they produce sugar. So what's neat is that is the base of our food chain. Fun fact, chloroplasts are also wrapped in an extra little layer of membrane, double bagged, kind of like mitochondria. It's a conversation for another time. But yeah, neat thing is, if you take water, right, and CO2, which is kind of the waste products that come out of us, if you put those in, look what comes out. The oxygen you breathe and food that all living things need. So we call these primary producers because they make what we need, right? The farmers of the planet, in a way, they're actually making the food. The green stuff is called chlorophyll. So let's put a nice little green highlight there. Chlorophyll. And it's neat because one form of chlorophyll is actually this color, this light green. But you'll notice in an animal cell, we don't have that. Not yet. I've always wondered, could they ever get a chloroplast? Hasn't happened yet. Seems to be something that plants and only plants have done, right? Cool. Chloroplasts. They make sugar. And that sugar is actually known as glucose, but sugar for now is fine. If you wanted to talk about a small bag of stuff, it's interesting how this comes up. So we looked at before at a vacuole, right? And a vacuole is big. So if you looked at a vacuole, big vacuole, right? And let's say it was a water vacuole. It's filled with They're clear because they got water in them. Vacuoles are big. Big bags. But if you look at a vesicle, they had to give it a new name. So they actually kind of made the vacuole name a little different. And they do vesicles. And vesicles are little itty bitty ones like this. And vesicles hold stuff, smaller amounts of material, right? So if you're transporting things around in the cell, right, these ones are usually water or food. Okay? They're just bags of materials. Vesicles are smaller. So if you're looking for little vesicles, right? Like, for example, if you're transporting hormones around or enzymes, right? Little ones. Let's say a bag of enzymes. If you were going to be breaking down food, right? Like, for example, your liver produces a lot of different enzymes and things like that. Well, actually, let's say your liver, I shouldn't say that. Your liver produces bile, which isn't an enzyme. It's kind of like soap. It's an emulsifier. Your liver does produce enzymes. The one I guess I would point on, just to make it simple, would be something like the one that breaks down alcohol if it's in our bloodstream. So yes, our liver makes enzymes, but I was trying to focus on something simpler. Yeah. Anyways, there you go. Little vesicles, little dudes. We have lots of them. Because animals eat a lot of stuff, we have to have lots of little bags of enzymes. So we have lots of vesicles. And they're usually named after what's inside them, right? So the name of whatever's inside names the vesicle. It's exciting stuff. Vesicles. I sort of think of them as like little vehicles carrying around stuff inside the cell. Yeah, they're not big. Plant cells do photosynthesis, so we kind of covered this. But really what happens, once you add sunlight, right? You need sunlight and you need water and you need minerals that you find in soil. But if we kind of looked at it, sort of like a chemical equation, which you probably haven't seen a lot because this is a grade 8. But if you take carbon dioxide, let's start properly. And you take water, which is H2O, you've seen this before, right? You can make sugar in the form of glucose, right? And you make CO2 waste, what am I doing? Not CO2 waste, it was CO2 on the input. You're making oxygen as a waste product, which is what the Archae Bacteria don't like. You and I need this. This is why we're going to take plants to Mars, because they're going to keep us alive and they're going to get rid of that nasty CO2 that we produce. But if you add sunlight, right? We put the sunlight, right? And we put the minerals. You can produce sugar and oxygen. And that's really what got life on the planet going. Needed this. Photosynthesis, which means, synthesis means to build up. And this means with light. It's neat, right? You kind of have to read the word in reverse. To build up with light. And we built up sugar. That was the whole idea. So our little friends here, right? These little green fellows. Green hors d'oeuvres here. So cute. They're responsible for doing it. And I'm going to tell you a secret. Bacteria did this before plants did. There's more to that tale, but that's for a later date. Fabulous. So photosynthesis, here it is, right? Producing that sugar. Now I'll tell you, the sugar's name is actually glucose, right? If you ever visit somebody in the hospital, they'll put this in their IV bag. Its formula is C6H12O6. I don't expect you to know that because you haven't done enough chemistry yet, but it's got a lot of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in the molecule. And it requires the H2O in, CO2 in, you get the O2 out, and you get the sugar out, right? And it's that sugar that moves up the food chain and keeps everything alive. It's chemical energy, folks. Technically, we turned light energy, or we used light energy. We didn't turn light energy, but we helped use light energy to transform some chemical reactions to fuel them to produce a form of chemical energy, right? Think of it as gas, because that's what we did. Slick. Yeah, it's neat. That's life. We need this. Before, the Archae Bacteria can't do this. Photosynthesis is relatively new on the planet compared to what the Archae Bacteria were doing. Archae Bacteria were just using chemicals and doing some chemical trickery to get energy out of chemical reactions. So that's what they're doing is older. Still gets done on the planet. They do something called chemosynthesis. But this is photosynthesis. So let's focus on this. Right? There's your full equation, right? I already showed this, so we won't take a lot of time here. Right? Add light. You know I can't help myself. There we go. And then that's where the gas comes from. O2 gas, right? And this is glucose, which is a very simple sugar for us to use. Now, it's not really being said here, so I'm going to point this out. Even plants have to take that sugar, right? And guess where they take it, right? They're going to take it to this little gas-powered generator that they have and that we have, right? It becomes fuel, right? Because you have to do work. So the little they made the gas, and the mitochondria mitochondrion just means one, burn the fuel. So I always keep it simple, right? Make the gas, burn the gas. Even plants have to burn, right? Have to burn the gasoline, the fuel, to do work. Because all these things we need to stay alive are not just going to happen on their own. They're going to take some energy, right? You need some kind of fuel to fuel the processes. Your vehicle doesn't move without some kind of fuel, and it's the same inside of a cell. So they have a big focus on photosynthesis here, but if you think about it, right, CO2 is in the air, right, as a gas, and water's in the, right, coming down in the form of rain all the time, right? So there you go. And that's a liquid. So the plant can take what it needs. The neat thing is it takes the carbon dioxide in from the underside of the leaf. That's actually where a lot of plants breathe in their carbon dioxide, right? CO2 goes in. Yeah, and then plants will also release oxygen gas out their leaves. It's neat. Water goes in through the roots, right, in the root system. Like if we're talking about land-based plants. Cool. It's the stuff of life, building up with light, because that's what photosynthesis means. Okay, let's carry on. I think this is a lot of slides to say the same thing for the record, but you can take a look at this, right? It's light energy becoming chemical energy, which I wrote on a previous slide. It's like I knew something was coming, right? And sugar becomes food for the plant, specifically in our little mitochondria, right? They need that. They burn it. And the thing is, if we eat plants, we consume them with all their chemical energy, and we burn that for fuel because we have those mitochondria, right? We do the same thing. We just can't make our own gas. It's like we have to steal it from somebody else. We have to eat things to get our fuel. And that's characteristic of animals. Animals don't make their own fuel, right? No, we don't. Some of this, it's warranted to say sometimes stuff gets stored underground. So if you ever look at a plant that makes something like a potato, right, it can build up excess sugar into the form of starch underground, right? So if you kind of look at the roots, if I was connecting the roots a little bit like this, right, depending on the plant, plants will make these structures. Carrots are really no different, right? They're just starch storage for a rainy day or like winter, things like that. Then we come along and take them, Yeah, it is pretty cool that we can do that and that plants made it possible. Right? There's the oxygen we need. So if we go to space, we've mentioned this a couple times, we're going to have to take something like a plant because we're going to need them to process our carbon dioxide and release our O2 gas, right? Carbon dioxide goes in as a gas, that's true, and oxygen comes out as a gas, right? Plants do produce some carbon dioxide when they do burn, right? I don't want you to forget this. They do produce some carbon dioxide because whenever you burn fuel, right, our little friend here is going to pop out some CO2, right? If you breathe on your hand, you can feel the water. That actually came when you did this. So sure, you can take in, right? You can take in the sugar to burn, right? And you can take in the oxygen that the plants produced. Of course. And the idea is you also get out energy. That's the big one, right? You get energy. I always say it's sort of like a generator. That's the energy that runs the whole show. So you could see that plants and animals are MFEO, made for each other, because the waste products we produce, they need just to make sugar. Perfect opposites. Cellular respiration is a neat trick. We did look at it there with the chloroplast, but cellular respiration, right? When you hear respiration, you sort of think about oxygen. That always comes up. So if you drew your mitochondrion, right, just like we did before, and we take in the oxygen, poof, right? We take in the, well, let's just say sugar, like glucose. We'll take that in, right? Oh, we're going to respire. You need the oxygen. It's this magical oxygen here. Like you cannot burn fuel without some type of gas, and you need, you guys would call it air, but thinking about the oxygen, right? Then when you respire, whenever you respire, right, what comes out of your mouth? That carbon dioxide gas, waste. You get the water, right? If you look out on if you park your vehicle on an incline driveway, every now and then you'll see water coming, there's water that came out of the tailpipe. Because whenever you burn fuel, you actually do produce carbon dioxide, water, and then you produce the energy needed to do work, like to move your vehicle along. Think about it. You had to burn the fuel to move the vehicle. So I like to draw a little lightning bolt to be oversimplistic like this. I draw bad lightning bolts. That's okay. You can laugh. Everybody else does. I learned to live with it a long time ago. So, like I say, you got mitochondria in plants because they have to burn their own, and in animals. They have to burn their own. So the nice thing about an online slideshow, you could always pause me, rewind me, slow me down, put me on closed caption. That goes funny. I notice my, what I'm saying doesn't come out so well in closed caption. But that's okay. AI will solve all that stuff, right? I think Google's listening. So some neat animations. Sorry, you can't click these, right? It's like a teacher thing, right? I would have to click that live in a slideshow. But cellular respiration really is when you take, if you're going to take the sugar and you were going to take your oxygen, right? You can burn it. We know this happens in the mitochondrion. So that's where it happens. And you produce CO2 plus water. And then you get your energy, right? And let's see if I can, how's my lightning bolt now? Shazam, there we go, poof. Hey, I won't color it in. So our little bunny is producing, you think of the carbon dioxide, right? The carbon dioxide's coming out of the mouth every time he breathes, right? And water is coming out as well, right? But he's taking the oxygen in, breathing that in. So you can see how plants are perfect for us, right? They make the fuel. And we take the fuel, eat the fuel, right? But then you think about, well, they need us because they get a lot of carbon dioxide and water from us, right? Oh, yeah. So we are hopelessly dependent upon each other. And that's good. That's what should be. They've just thrown in the equation, but hey, let's go further. Why be boring? So if you take glucose and you combine it with oxygen, you get CO2, H2O, and later on I'll tell you what the energy is. It's actually chemical energy, but we'll just put the lightning bolt. How many kids are going to draw lightning bolts on my tests? Let me guess. It represents energy, kids. That's what I'm trying to get across to you. So I just want you to think about, you don't have to write this in your notes, but I want you to think about what that is in reverse. Isn't that photosynthesis in reverse? Ooh, wait, maybe it is. Yeah, except you need sunlight. But yes. Yes. Plants are doing this in the opposite direction than we are. It is a very interesting thought, isn't it? Which is why we're going to have to take these with us to Mars. We're going to need it because we'll build up too much carbon dioxide on the trip and we'll need oxygen. So, plus we'll need stuff to eat, right? Can't just pack rations. A long ways to go. So cellular respiration is just the burning of the fuel, right? To survive. That's really what we're talking about. Because something has to power cell processes. That's the idea. Okay? We need that energy, right? To transport things around inside of us, to fight infections, to do all the things that living things need to do. That's what we need it for. So the way to think about it is our cells need to respire and use the fuel. Right? When you go on a run, think about you're respiring and you're taking in all this energy to keep running. Yeah, because your cells need the fuel to help you run. That's the thing. So this diagram's really neat because it shows how photosynthesis built everything up in this direction and how cellular respiration is when you take the fuel. Basically, it's about making the fuel and then, right? Sort of think about it. We burn it, right? So you get the fuel and you get the oxygen, and then by the time we're done, you get the carbon dioxide and the water that the plant needed. It needs that stuff. Oh, just like we need this stuff to survive, right? And at the very tippy top, you see the sun. You sort of think about it. Once Mother Nature evolved to use the energy of the sun to make fuel through photosynthesis, we had a process that was basically fueling life on the planet. Not just life for the plants, but everything that ate the plants, right? Literally changed our atmosphere. This molecule down here called oxygen is the reason why our planet is so pretty and blue. One of the reasons. Oh, yeah. Before oxygen, our oceans would have been kind of a greeny turquoise, right? Yep. The oxygen content in the atmosphere, I believe, is about 20%. That's pretty good. 20 is higher than 0. So take it in. Let it set in, right? This is a diagram I would probably redraw just for myself, just to prove that I knew it. Photosynthesis makes the fuel, and then you burn the fuel. And the waste products help start it again. Yep. Absolutely. So eating plants is a good thing. Well, we wouldn't survive if we didn't do it, right? They're primary producers. Neat. So just a quick summary, right? You use the sugar. You burn the sugar through cellular respiration. And that's the idea. If you study this topic further, I'll tell you right now, when you get to university, there's a lot more to this topic that you're going to cover. But to keep it simple for grade 8, it's just make the sugar in the oxygen. Don't forget O2, right? Because our little bunny friend here needs it. Or he's going to suffocate. And then the plant, well, bunny did the plant a solid because he made the CO2 and in a way helped out with producing some of the water that plant was going to need. So MFEO, made for each other. And it's cool. A lot of slides to say the same thing, but it's just a summary, right? Plants need the CO2 and the water to do the photosynthesis. Let's just highlight that. Yay. Yep. So on a trip to Mars, the plants are helping, or the animals are helping the plants because they're giving them the ingredients. You can think of it this way. These are like photosynthesis ingredients. That's what we're talking about here. And it's pretty cool. Making the fuel. All right, take it in. Let it wash over you. I'm waiting for you to write that down. I can't help myself. It's fun. One of the biggest transformation moments in history is when bacteria, they're the first ones that figured out how to do this, could use light energy to pull this off. Like I say, plants were the originals. They're not the OG photosynthesizers. No. Hey, I think we've reached the end. So some deep thought moments for the students, right? What are some similarities between plants and animals? So you can do the old Venn diagram of plants and animals and figure out what's unique and what's different, right? The stuff in the middle, right, would be what they share in common. And I'll tell you right now, something that comes to mind there would be something like, they both have something like this, okay? They both would have common characteristic. In this case, we're talking about an energy maker, right, which is our little friend here known as a mitochondrion. They both have stuff like that and stuff like cytoplasm, right? What's different? Well, animals don't have cell walls, so that's kind of a thing you should consider. So, discussion questions. You've got more, right? How are photosynthesis different? How are they the same? So again, another Venn diagram moment, right? Photosynthesis and cell respiration. Photo, cell, resp. One thing I would say right now is what they have in common, they're both life processes, right? But they happen in different organelles, right? Photosynthesis will always happen in that green one, for example, right? With the little stacks we call chloroplasts. It'll always happen there. Whereas cell respiration, well, if you're going to burn the fuel, that always happens in this one, right? Difference. But pretty cool stuff. And I've gone on at length. I tried to keep it short. I did my best. Have a good one, folks.